Now we'll move on to our next speaker, a new friend to the program, but a very distinguished neuroscientist, Dr. Georg Northoff, who's the Canada Research Chair in Mind, Brain Imaging and Neuroethics, and Chair, Michael Smith Chair in Neuroscience and Mental Health at the University of Ottawa. He's going to talk to us about neuroscience of identity and culture. George.
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
And that I'm not mute and visible. Okay, you never know. Yeah, good morning. Thanks for this invitation to this exciting program and a real neurophilosophical mix. And as you know, some of you may know that I did a lot of establishing neurophilosophy in a non-reductive way, and on a theoretical level as well as on the conceptual level, on the empirical level. And you see some of that today and some of that bridge. And I was asked to give a presentation linking about identity and culture and the brain. So I found the task not so easy. I hope I managed somehow. So, and despite all the progress and the beautiful recent talk I had the chance of listening to, we still really don't know what exactly is the connection between the neuronal and the mental. So why does the neuronal activity transform into something as mental? It's basically similar to the question, why does the chemical formula of H2O translates into something as fluid or vapor or ice, what we call water? So that transformation process, we really don't know. And that, of course, when we, for instance, experience an identity over time, I'm still the same person as 5 minutes ago, at least I think so. And we also know that there's strong cultural impact. So that's sort of trying to make this connection between the brain and the mental side, and at the same time also the cultural context. So you see, it's a difficult one. So, and here I paradigmatically showed sort of the, let me put you to the side here, really the gaps which we have. So we have cultural effects. When you go to the Far Eastern world in Japan or China, you have a different sense of self. People define themselves more in an interdependent way through other people. Whereas in the Western world, particularly the Anglo-American world, it's more sort of an individualized definition. And I think no more becomes that more clear than in the current COVID crisis. So the question is now, how are these two links? How is it possible that our sense of self is culturally dependent? You would assume that if the self is purely intra-individual, that there are no contextual or cultural factors in determining the self and our brain. So, and of course I say the brain is not just inside the brain, but is intrinsically linked with the cultural context. So, and I cite here something very nice when you go into social sciences. Pierre Bourdieu, famous social scientist in France, from France, he defined, what are we looking for when we look for cultural effect? We look to the purely social scientific quote, nothing to do with the brain. We look for structures that generate and organize practices and representations of culture, or the systems of durations or transposable dispositions. So now you say, what on earth does he mean by that? And what on earth can that, how can that be related to the brain? So when I tell you what I did, I conceived the brain in exactly this kind of way, because we have in our brain, we don't only just have activity in response to external stimuli or context, for instance, when you see me, but even when I disappear from the screen right now, your brain will still be active and show continuous spontaneous activity. And we don't really know in current neuroscience the role and function of this spontaneous activity. I try to provide you some clue, because the main idea and also the empirical data supporting that our brain spontaneous or intrinsic activity provides certain disposition and a particular temporo-spatial structure. And that is key for linking the brain to the culture, and on the other hand, of yielding some kind of sense of self. So our brain, and you will see that metaphor throughout my talk, our brain spontaneous activity, as I said, is continuously active, even in sleep. Your brain is very active. It's basically like a runner who cannot stop running. Yeah, but there's a certain pattern to the activity. So the runner is not completely arbitrary or random. And when you go to the seaside, I'm a big fan of the seaside, living here in Canada. We have a lot of ocean and Pacific on both sides. You see there's a certain pattern. You see very powerful big waves. Yeah, these are the kind of waves you appreciate as a surfer. And these big waves are extremely powerful, so they can smash you right back to the beach. And then you have small waves here on the right one. They're more frequent and faster, of course, they're more frequent, but not as powerful. And you will see, so there's a certain relation between more powerful slow waves and longer lasting the slow waves. There's longer, as we say, longer cycle durations, and the faster waves, of course, shorter and less powerful. And I will come back, and that's the same what you see in nature, the same kind of pattern you see in our brains, spontaneous activity, and you will see that pattern is key for mental features. So roughly, this is about certain patterns in our neural activity over time. This is what we call dynamics, and it has a certain spatial organization. Big waves in the sea waves are more extended, more spatially extended. Faster waves are more located in space. So meaning there's a certain temporal spatial dynamics. And you will see my talk is basically just all about that. How is this temporal spatial dynamics relevant for mental feature and culture? So, and I present you here a beautiful quote, completely different context. Nikola Tesla, who lived at the end of the 19th century, turned 20th century. And look at his Google site, a very colorful guy, at least as colorful as Elon Musk, who also, the Tesla cars and the Tesla company, because he has it from there. So beautiful quote here. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. And you could basically reformulate the same. If you want to find the secrets of the brain-mind connection, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. And that's something I'm doing here in my talk now. So my talk, after my prelude, now will have basically three main tasks, three main parts. First is what I call the basis model of self, that self-identity is not a higher order cognitive function, as often suggested in philosophy, but it's a very basic, most basic functional role of the brain, and that converges very nicely with the model of integrating self and other, what we just heard in the recent talk, and you will see that. So self and identity are a spatial temporal structure and disposition of our brain. Second, then, of course, you cannot see this one here. It's difficult here with the Zoom. I never know where to put you. So link of brain and self through time and space is key. And then at the end, I really want to come back to culture and identity. And again, the main claim is here, spatio-temporal dynamics, linking cultural effects and sense of self and the brain. So basically, if you have no time anymore, the main message of my talk is very simple. Just consider the brain's temporal spatial dynamic. That's all. And that gives you a key why we have these kinds of phenomena. So first part about the self. I hope, I know it's already late afternoon in Geneva. Here in Ottawa, it's early morning, so I just woke up and I looked into the mirror and yeah, it's Georg Northoff. Yeah, and then I took a shower and so on and so forth. And you say, oh, come on, this is trivial what here this psychiatrist tells us. No, it's not trivial, because I have many patients, still seeing patients as a clinical psychiatrist. For them, it's not evident that what they see in the mirror, that it is their self. Yeah, the most extreme cases is that you have schizophrenic patients who feel themselves as either Jesus or Mao and so on. And here already that, and then they also dress up. I remember one of my first patients as a resident who was lying in a bed, had a long beard and a white clothes. That was back in Germany. And he didn't speak at all when I came into the room, and I asked him, I would like to interview you, and blah, 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 and so on and so. And no reaction. Suddenly, after a couple of minutes, he finally got up and said, how can you dare to speak to me? I am Jesus. And then he knocked me down. So, yeah, I nevertheless decided to become a psychiatrist in order to understand this. And here again, a very interesting cultural phenomenon. These changes in identity are culturally dependent. So when you go to the Western world, the Christian world, you see a lot of Jesuses. However, when you go to China, where I have a lot of collaborations, you suddenly see some people who think they are Chairman Mao. So even the kind of identity they take on is culturally dependent. Yeah. In India, I have seen several Buddhas. Yeah. So I've met them all these religious founders. Yeah. Good. So how is it possible? Again, I told you about the waves. The brain is really like the seaside. It has very powerful slow waves, which we can measure in functional magnetic resonance imaging, and has less powerful faster waves. And you saw that this looks very noisy. This is the original signal, but in this signal, there's a lot of structure and pattern. And all our neuroscience is basically tailored towards deciphering the pattern in that, for instance, here with slow and fast waves. And then you can analyze these kind of slow waves with different measures from engineering, scale-free activity, power law exponent, autocorrelation window. I don't want to go into detail, but these are measures which basically describe the temporal structure. So meaning there is system in the change. And we then found in various studies, to our surprise, that just when you have a pure resting state, you don't do anything, you just lie there, keep your eyes closed, and you have these waves, and that these waves, the relationship between slow and fast waves, measured by scale-free activity power law exponent, directly predicts your degree of self-consciousness. That's what we show here, meaning this is what we call a power spectrum. These are the slower frequencies, faster frequencies. This is the power. And you see there's much more power in the slower frequencies. And the more steeper this curve, meaning the more power in the slow frequencies relative to the faster, the higher your degree of self-consciousness. So meaning your slow waves may draw in the brain, may drive your they are very powerful, and they're long because they're slow. Yeah, so meaning there's a certain temporal continuity involved in your self-consciousness. Same here, you already saw that picture. And based on, and because this was already happening in the resting state, because the traditional assumption is that the self is a higher order function which requires special forms of cognition, meta-awareness, working memory, attention, meta-representation. But nothing of that is present in the resting state because you're not exposed to external input. Yeah, so and that's why we said, oh, maybe the brain is not a higher order function, which is usually associated with philosophical views going back to Descartes and then Kant and others. And that has been transferred into neuroscience when we look for specific higher order cognitive functions associated with the self. However, we say maybe it's already in the spontaneous activity when you're even not aware, you don't have explicit consciousness of yourself, your sense of self is already there because it's represented in these kind of ways. So that led us in this paper that maybe the self is more sort of a basic, the most basic function. And that's what we try to indicate here. And that is sort of realized through certain spatial-temporal patterns, dynamic, slow, fast wave, topographical distribution, which I didn't go into here. And that in turn then impacts all other functions like our emotions, like our action, and our cognition. And that makes very much sense. In all our action, there's always a certain self-specificity. Our emotions, I experience my emotions, is my emotions. Yeah, and even our cognition is strongly driven by self-specificity. So meaning the self is sort of like a 3D, like I like to indicate with this painting. You all know this, Last Supper from Leonardo da Vinci in Milano. And it's basically like you see in this painting here, you see a 2D canvas, but what Leonardo da Vinci does is extending it in a virtual 3D way. You see, when you had a 1 millisecond second, you would assume that these apostles would take on a different gesture, because it's really, there's an intrinsic dynamics. You see also this 3D space. And that's basically what our self is. It creates a virtual 3D structure, and that's our self. So now let me, you already know this, let me come to the second part. What does the self do? One key thing for the self is that it integrates different inputs across time. So we are continuously bombarded. You see, I'm speaking fast because I want to keep this in my half hour, but you need to follow my speech. Yeah, so I speak a couple of seconds later, I speak about something else, but your brain needs to link that to what I said before, because otherwise you say Northoff is just speaking randomly, he has no idea. Yeah, maybe you say this, maybe I should speak a little slower. However, so meaning your brain needs to link very discrete time points. What I said a couple of seconds earlier, it needs to link now to what is said now. It's like listening to a melody. Yeah, but and what I said earlier is already past. You don't hear it anymore, but your brain still represents it. And that's amazing. Yeah, and it represents it in a meaningful way in relation to what I say now. So that's, so meaning temporal integration across different time points. And what we hear, this is another study where we ask subjects, so with delay, so they had to attribute their self-specificity, detect whether a stimulus had self-specific properties after a certain delays. Yeah, so we built in a temporal delay, and then we saw maybe that over the delays, the self-specificity got lost or changed. And what we could see here, you could see this here in the lower right, this is basically, you have much better temporal integration of even distant items or closer items. These are the temporal distances we insert in the paradigm for self-specific items. So your sense of self, and that makes sense. And then we correlated that temporal integration on the psychological level with neuronal measures of temporal integration. Again, in the resting state, we had again here this wave stuff, slow versus fast wave, scale-free activity. And you could see again that the stronger your slower frequency power relative to the faster, the better your temporal integration on the psychological level. So I probably skip this slide. Yeah, let me just, so your self has a certain temporal structure. You see that faster frequencies are nested and contained within slower frequencies like the Russian dolls. It has temporal continuity. Yeah, so it can link different time scales, slow and fast, long and short. It has temporal continuity over time, and that's exactly what we perceive. Yeah, and it can integrate different stimuli. So that is sort of, you see, our self as a purely temporal characterization, and that's what we also experience. We experience a sense of continuity. It's independent of shorter of longer time scales, and we have an experience of a unity. Yeah, and that's analogous spatial pattern on the neuronal side. So now my first main answer in this question: what connects brain and self? Why is neuronal activity transformed into the experience of mental activity, into the experience of a sense of self? That is the key question. And what we assume, this is really time and space. So the temporal spatial dynamics of the brain transforms into corresponding temporal spatial dynamics on the mental level. And what we are currently, and we call this common currencies, this was a larger paper last year in Physics of Life Reviews, where we introduced this concept of common currency, meaning that shared, the temporal spatial dynamics is shared by neuronal and mental activity. And that's why we say that's what we mean by spatiotemporal neuroscience, that spatiotemporal neuroscience describes this pattern on the neuronal level and then see how it organizes our cognition, our emotions on the cognitive and the mental level. So that we basically do not look so much for the specific cognitive contents, but that we look for the spatiotemporal structure within which these cognitive contents are processed on the psychological level. So finally, I can come back to the main issue and the task I was given, culture and identity. So, and remember, I cited the structure and disposition for this. Remember, I had this initial quote by Pierre Bourdieu: structures which generate and organize practices and representations of culture, or the systems of transposable disposition. So now I hope I gave you some background that these kind of durable transposable dispositions may be related to the temporal spatial dynamics of our spontaneous activity. So now, of course, the question is, how is that related to the cultural context? So now I need to make just one more leap, and I see I have 8 minutes time. So let me go a little bit into cultural neuroscience. For me, it's one of the most exciting fields, because what you see, this is well defined in cultural psychology by Marcus Kitayama. So they speak of an independent self in the more Western, particularly the Anglo-American cultures. It's more independent where the self defines itself purely on intrasubjective grounds, independent of the other person. Yeah. So here the emphasis is very strong on individual freedom, and nobody else, another person, cannot contain my individual freedom. And you see that kind of line of argument very strong in those people who are against vaccination and all the COVID measures, because they argue that that restricts their individual freedom. Yeah. Then there is a more interdependent self, where the self is defines itself through and in the relation to the other. This is particular in more Far Eastern countries, for instance, in Japan or China, when basically it is acknowledged that when the other feels well in my relation to me, that is also beneficial for my own self. Yeah, so here you see, and I think the one typical instances was in Japan, that even before the COVID, then when you have some flu, or that you immediately wear a mask not to infect the other. Yeah, because if you infect the others, your relationship to the other might deteriorate, and that in turn impacts your own self. Yeah, so this is really a difference. And myself, I'm often in Far Asia. I have a lot of connection in Japan and in Taiwan and in China. I can really feel the difference. And as you hear from my accent, I come from the middle, meaning from Europe and Germany. It's really a difference here than also being here in Canada. So now the question is, where do these differences coming from? Yes, there are cultural contexts, but if we assume that the self is mediated by the brain, then the brain must also be susceptible to cultural context. So here we tested for this in a psychological and neuronal study. First we tested for the degree of psychological similarity. We applied a self-consciousness inventory, self-consciousness scale, and we looked how much the ratings between the subjects within the culture, China or Canada, differ from each other. If you define yourself more individually, you would assume that the Canadians, the Western people, have more inter-individual differences or distances in the self-consciousness scale score, and that's exactly what you can see here. These are the two Canadian groups, and you see much larger differences between subjects in their scores of self-consciousness when compared to the Chinese, meaning the self-consciousness scores were more similar among subjects in the Chinese than in the Canadian group. So and that really tells you that there maybe is also a more higher degree of psychological similarity. So now we want to see how is that on the neuronal side. So this is what you call a typical power spectrum. This is a frequency, this is a power. And this is an EEG study. And what you can already see, look, here, this is what we call the alpha peak around 8 to 12 hertz. And you can already see there's a lot of variability where this alpha peak here is and the power, and you see each line is one subject. You see a marked difference in the shape of the power spectrum between different subjects. Now look at the Chinese people, you see much more homogeneous. Yeah, and that also we then calculated various kinds of measures, intersubject correlation, intersubject distance, and both confirming that the shape of the power spectrum is more similar among Chinese than the Canadian subject. Then we also did this alpha peak frequency, and you can already see here, these are the Canadians, these are the Chinese. You see a much more similarity, and this is also expressed here in the degree of similarity. That the alpha peak frequency, the shape, is much more different between subjects in the Canadians than in the Chinese group. So you see really that the culture has an impact on the structure of the temporal spatial dynamics here. So this was quite an amazing finding for me. And this meaning the temporal spatial structure in the spontaneous activity being highly susceptible also to the cultural context might reflect some what the social scientist Pierre Bourdieu said as structures of durable transposable dispositions. Yeah, so then remember I had introduced this concept of shared features or common currency, and I introduced it between brain and self, brain and mind, but now we might need to extend this. So maybe our brain picks up the spatial-temporal dynamics of its environmental context that shapes the brain's spontaneous activity, and that in turn shapes its mental features. So we have shared features or common currency, temporal spatial dynamics between world, brain, and self-identity. That's what I want to say with this slide. And of course, this is a new approach, and you already see there's a lot of gaps in there, but it's really a new way, a different way of looking at the brain. So, and also, I didn't indicate that here, that also, this is purely empirical, but it also can be extended to the philosophical realm, that you basically have what you call now for the philosophers, temporal spatial ontology that I developed in this book, 2018. And that also you see then the brain-mind problem really is dissolved and it's becoming more sort of what kind of temporal spatial patterns are around. Yeah, I hope I stayed in time. Basically, main message, time-space dynamics of the world connects culture and self through the brain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, for a great lecture. Thank you very much.